close your eyes and let yourself drift backward through time, not to the grand halls of kings or the thunderous clash of famous battles, but to the quiet corners of medieval Europe where mysteries still linger in the mist. Tonight, we journey together through 10 stories that history half remembered and time almost forgot. These are not tales of glory, but of strangeness, of questions without answers, of moments when the ordinary world brushed against something inexplicable. The medieval world was not the simple place we sometimes imagine. It was a landscape of deep forests and winding rivers, of small villages where everyone knew each other's secrets, and of long winter nights when the darkness seemed alive with possibility. In this world, the line between the natural and the supernatural was thin, almost transparent. A strange child could emerge from the earth. A book could be written in a language no one had ever heard. A man pulled from the sea might not be a man at all. We begin our journey in the year 1170 in a small village in Suffolk, England during harvest time. The fields are golden, the air is warm, and the villagers are gathering their crops. But something is about to happen that will puzzle chroniclers for the next 8.5 centuries, something that will make us question what we think we know about the boundaries of the possible. Let yourself relax as we enter this world together. There is no need to stay alert, no need to remember every detail. Simply allow these stories to wash over you like gentle waves. If you drift into sleep, that is exactly as it should be. The mysteries will still be there in the morning, waiting patiently as they have waited for hundreds of years. Tonight, you are safe and comfortable, far removed from the struggles of the medieval world. You're simply a listener, a witness to events that unfolded long ago. The people in these stories lived and breathed and wondered just as we do. They faced mysteries they could not solve, just as we still face mysteries today. Their world was both utterly different from ours and strangely, comfortingly familiar. So settle deeper into your pillow. Let the tension drain from your shoulders. Feel your breathing slow and deepen. We have 10 stories to explore together, and there is no hurry. Time moves differently here, in this space between waking and sleeping, between the known and the unknown. The medieval world awaits, patient and timeless, ready to share its secrets. Imagine a warm August afternoon in the village of Woolpit. The harvest is nearly complete, and the reapers are working their way through the last field of grain. The rhythmic swish of their scythes fills the air, accompanied by the drowsy buzz of insects and the occasional call of a bird. It is an ordinary day, unremarkable in every way, until someone notices movement near the old wolf pits that give the village its name. At first they think it might be animals, perhaps deer that have wandered too close to the village. But as the reapers approach, they see something that makes them stop in their tracks. 2 children are standing at the edge of the field, a boy and a girl, perhaps 8 and 10 years old. They are holding hands and looking around with expressions of complete bewilderment. But it is not their confusion that freezes the reapers in place. It is the colour of their skin. The children are green, not painted green, not sick with some yellowish tinge, but genuinely, undeniably green, the colour of spring leaves or fresh grass. Their clothing is made from an unfamiliar material, woven in a style no one recognises. They speak to each other in a language that sounds like nothing the villagers have ever heard. When the reapers try to speak to them, the children simply stare, uncomprehending and afraid. The villagers, after their initial shock, do what people often do when faced with the inexplicable. They take the children to the nearest authority figure, in this case the landowner, Sir Richard de Calne. Sir Richard, for his part, responds with a mixture of curiosity and practical concern. The children are clearly terrified and exhausted. Whatever their origin, they need food and shelter. But here the mystery deepens. The children refuse to eat. They turn away from bread, from meat, from cheese, from everything the villagers offer them. Days pass, and the children grow weaker, their green skin taking on a sickly pallor. Sir Richard's household begins to fear the children will simply starve to death, unable or unwilling to accept any form of sustenance. Then one day, someone brings in beans, freshly harvested and still in their pods. The children's reaction is immediate and startling. They seize the beans with evident delight, but instead of shelling them in the normal way, they tear open the stalks, clearly expecting to find the beans inside the hollow stems. When shown how to open the pods properly, they eat the raw beans with obvious hunger and relief. For weeks afterward, this is all they will consume, raw beans and nothing else. Gradually, very gradually, the children begin to adapt to their new world. They learn to eat other foods. They start to pick up words of the local language. The girl proves quicker at this than the boy, but both make progress. However, the boy, who had been the weaker of the two from the beginning, sickens and dies within a few months of their arrival. The cause of his death is not recorded, but the medieval world was dangerous for children, and a child already weakened by stress and starvation would have been particularly vulnerable. The girl survives. As the months and years pass, her green colour slowly fades, replaced by a normal, healthy complexion. She grows up in Sir Richard's household, eventually learning English well enough to communicate fluently. She's baptized, given a Christian name, and as far as the records show, lives an ordinary life. She even marries, some accounts say, becoming the wife of a man from the nearby village of Lena. But before her colour faded entirely, before she became just another medieval woman whose name would be forgotten by history, she told her story. Or at least, she tried to. The account that comes down to us is fragmentary and strange, filtered through the understanding of 12th century monks who recorded it. The girl said that she and her brother came from a land called St. Martin's Land. In this place the sun never shone brightly. It was always twilight, a perpetual dusk where the light was soft and green. The people there were all green like herself and her brother. It was a Christian land, she insisted. They had churches, they knew of God and the saints, but it was separated from the sunlit world by a wide river. One day, she said, she and her brother were tending their father's animals when they heard a loud sound like bells ringing. Curious, they followed the sound and found themselves in a cave or passage. They walked through the darkness for what seemed like a long time, following the sound of the bells. Then suddenly they emerged into blazing sunlight, brighter than anything they had ever experienced, so bright it was almost painful. Disoriented and confused, they wandered until they were found by the reapers in the field. She could not explain, or perhaps did not know, where the passage was or how to return to it. She never saw her homeland again. What are we to make of this story? The account comes to us from two independent chroniclers who were writing within a generation or two of the events. William of Newburgh, a careful historian not given to recording obvious fantasies, includes it in his Chronicle of English History. So does Ralph of Coggeshall, an abbot whose position required a certain sobriety of judgment. Neither man claims to have met the children himself, but both indicate that their sources were people who had direct knowledge of the events. Modern researchers have proposed various explanations. Perhaps the children were suffering from a dietary deficiency that gave their skin a greenish tinge, a condition known as hyperchromic anemia or chlorosis. Perhaps they were Flemish immigrants, children who had become separated from their parents during a time of persecution, and whose trauma left them unable to communicate. The strange clothing and language might simply have been Flemish, unfamiliar to the English villagers. The story of St. Martin's Land could have been the confused memory of the Flemish region, filtered through the mind of a traumatized child, and then further filtered through translation and the expectations of medieval listeners. The perpetual twilight might have been a memory of the long northern summers where darkness never fully falls, or perhaps we will never know. Perhaps the green children will remain what they have always been, a mystery from a time when the world still had room for the inexplicable. Let this thought carry you gently towards sleep. The image of two frightened children standing at the edge of a field, green as summer grass, holding hands in a world they did not understand. The sea does not give up its secrets easily, but sometimes, just sometimes, something strange rises from the depths. Let us travel now to the coast of Suffolk, to the small fishing town of Orford, in the year 1167. The North Sea stretches grey and restless beyond the shingle beach, and the fishermen are preparing their nets for another day's work. These are practical men, familiar with every mood of the ocean. They know the seals that bask on the sandbanks. They know the dolphins that sometimes follow their boats. They know the strange fish that occasionally appear in their nets, carried north by warm currents from distant waters. But on this particular morning, they pull something from the sea that defies all their experience. At first, they think their net has snagged on something heavy, perhaps a waterlogged tree trunk or a piece of wreckage. The net strains and pulls, heavier than any normal catch. The men work together, hauling hand over hand, expecting at any moment for the net to tear or the burden to break free. But instead, something rises from the water, something that makes the fishermen step back in alarm. It is a man, or something very like a man. He is naked, his body covered in hair, particularly thick on the chest and face. His beard is long and matted with seaweed. He does not speak or cry out, but stares at the fisherman with eyes that seem somehow wild, unfocused, almost animal. The fishermen, uncertain what else to do, bring their catch to the castle. Orford Castle is a relatively new structure, built by King Henry II, and the castellan in charge is Bartholomew de Glanville, a man of education and curiosity. When he sees what the fishermen have brought him, he is as baffled as they are. The creature, for want of a better word, is kept in the castle, and here begins a strange period of observation, carefully recorded by the chronicler Ralph of Coggeshall, the same monk who wrote about the green children. Ralph's account is clinical, almost scientific in its attention to detail, which makes it all the more unsettling. The wild man will not speak. He makes sounds, grunts and noises, but nothing that resembles language. When offered food, he eats, but his preferences are strange. He will eat fish, but only after performing an odd ritual. He takes the fish in his hands and squeezes it, wringing out all the moisture as if he were wringing water from a cloth. Only then, when the fish is as dry as he can make it, will he consume it. He eats raw and cooked food with equal indifference, showing no preference for either. His daily rhythms follow the sun in a way that seems almost instinctive. At sunset he seeks out a place to sleep, and remains there until sunrise, as regular as the tides themselves. There is something deeply unsettling about this behaviour, this creature that looks like a man but acts according to patterns that seem more animal than human. The castellan, educated in the learning of his time, knows that there are tests to determine whether a being possesses a soul. The first test is language, the use of reason. Despite all attempts, the wild man remains mute. The second test is religious devotion, the recognition of the sacred. They take him to the church, hoping for some sign of understanding, some flicker of recognition before the altar. But the wild man shows nothing. He does not kneel, does not bow his head, does not make the sign of the cross. He stares at the crucifix with the same blank expression he shows to everything else. To the medieval mind, this is deeply troubling. A being with the shape of a man but without speech or soul occupies an uncertain space in creation, neither beast nor human. The months pass. The wild man remains a prisoner, though whether he understands his captivity is unclear. Then the castellan, perhaps growing weary of the mystery or perhaps moved by some impulse of mercy, decides to allow the wild man to return to his element. He is taken to the harbour and released into the water, but strong nets are placed to prevent his escape to the open sea. What happens next is described by Ralph with evident surprise. The wild man dives under the nets with ease, surfacing on the far side in the open water. The guards shout in alarm, certain he will flee, but the wild man does something unexpected. He swims back toward shore, dives under the nets again, and returns to his captors. It is as if he is demonstrating something, proving a point. "I can leave," his actions seem to say, "but I choose to return." For 2 more months he remains at the castle. His voluntary return has earned him a measure of trust, or perhaps his keepers have simply become complacent. Then one day he simply walks away. He makes his way back to the sea, and this time he does not return. He swims away into the grey waters of the North Sea and is never seen again. What was the wild man of Orford? The chronicler Ralph does not claim to know. He presents the facts as they were reported to him, and leaves judgment to the reader. Modern scholars have debated the question for years. Could it have been a seal or walrus, misidentified by frightened fishermen? But the description is so insistently human in form, and the observers were men familiar with every sea creature of their region. More likely, perhaps, it was indeed a human being, a sailor shipwrecked and traumatized, driven to silence by some terrible experience. The thick body hair might have been unusual, but not impossible. The strange eating habits could have been the desperate adaptations of a man surviving on raw fish. The lack of response in the church might have indicated someone from a non-Christian culture, or simply a mind broken by trauma. The swimming display, returning voluntarily after demonstrating the ability to escape, suggests intelligence and perhaps a kind of test, a wild creature proving it remained by choice, not compulsion, and finally, when ready, choosing freedom over captivity. We will never know his story, never learn what waters he came from, or what fate befell him after he swam away from Orford. He remains what he was to Bartholomew de Glanville and the fishermen who found him, a mystery pulled from the depths, a question the sea chose not to answer. Let this image drift through your mind as sleep approaches, a figure swimming away into grey water, leaving only questions in his wake. Summer heat lies heavy on the city of Strasbourg in the year 1518. The cobblestone streets radiate warmth even as evening approaches. The air is thick and still, carrying the smells of a crowded medieval city, not all of them pleasant. In this heat, in this troubled summer, something strange is about to begin. A woman named Frau Troffia steps into the street and begins to dance. There is no music, no celebration, no apparent reason. She simply starts moving, her feet tracing patterns on the cobblestones, her body swaying and turning. At first, passers-by smile, perhaps thinking she has had too much wine, perhaps assuming this is some private joy. But Frau Troffea does not stop dancing. An hour passes, then another. The sun sets and still she dances. Concerned neighbours try to speak with her, try to lead her home, but she pulls away and continues her strange solitary dance. Night falls and torches are lit, and in their flickering light Frau Trophäa dances on. By morning, her feet are bleeding, but she does not stop. This continues for days. Frau Trophäa dances without rest, without sleep, driven by some compulsion no one can understand. And then something even stranger happens. Others begin to join her. One by one, then in groups, the citizens of Strasbourg begin to dance. Within a week, 34 people are dancing in the streets. Within a month, the number has grown to somewhere around 400. They dance in the hot July sun until they collapse from exhaustion. They are carried to the side, given water, allowed to rest briefly, and then the compulsion seizes them again, and they return to the dance. Some dance until their feet are raw and blooded. Some dance until their hearts give out. The chroniclers of the time, usually so restrained in their language, describe people dancing themselves to death. The city authorities, faced with a crisis they do not understand, consult with physicians and scholars. The prevailing medical theory of the time holds that the dancing is caused by hot blood and overheating of the humours. The recommended treatment, bizarrely to modern ears, is to encourage more dancing. The logic is that the afflicted must dance the fever out of their systems, must continue until the malady has run its course. So the city authorities make a decision that seems almost madness in retrospect. They build stages for the dancers. They hire musicians to provide accompaniment. They open guild halls and market squares to give the dancers more room. The idea is to facilitate the cure, to help the afflicted dance themselves back to health. It does not work. If anything, the frenzy intensifies. The music and the official sanction seem to draw more people into the dance. The streets of Strasbourg become a scene from a nightmare, filled with exhausted people moving in endless, compulsive rhythms, their faces blank or twisted with distress, unable to stop even as their bodies fail them. The death toll is not precisely recorded, but contemporary accounts speak of dozens dying. Some collapse and do not rise again. Some suffer heart attacks or strokes brought on by extreme exertion in the summer heat. Some simply dance until their bodies can endure no more and they slip away, their feet still moving even as life leaves them. What caused the dancing plague of Strasbourg? Even today, scholars debate the question. One theory points to ergot, a fungus that grows on rye and other grains, particularly in damp conditions. Ergot poisoning, also known as St. Anthony's fire, can cause convulsions, hallucinations, and involuntary muscle spasms. In extreme cases, it can indeed cause uncontrollable movements that might resemble dancing. The summer of 1518 had been damp before the heat set in. Perfect conditions for ergot to flourish. The bread eaten by the poorer citizens of Strasbourg would have been made from rye, the grain most susceptible to ergot contamination. This could explain the physical compulsion, the inability to stop moving. But ergot poisoning alone does not fully explain the pattern of the outbreak. The dancing began with one woman and spread to others, which suggests a social or psychological component. This has led other scholars to propose that the dancing plague was a case of mass psychogenic illness, what we might today call mass hysteria. The citizens of Strasbourg in 1518 had many reasons for psychological distress. The region had recently experienced famines and disease. The city was in the grip of religious and social upheaval. The Holy Roman Empire was fragmenting along religious lines as the Protestant Reformation spread. people lived with uncertainty and fear as constant companions. In such conditions, some researchers argue the human mind can break in strange ways. One person's distress manifests as compulsive dancing. Others, witnessing this and living under the same stressful conditions, unconsciously imitate the behavior. The compulsion spreads not through physical contagion, but through a kind of psychological contagion, each dancer triggering the same response in susceptible observers. There is also a religious dimension to consider. The dancers were said to be suffering from a curse, specifically a curse from St. Vitus, a Christian martyr associated with both dancing and with diseases that caused involuntary movement. There was a long tradition in the region of dancing pilgrimages, where believers would dance their way to a shrine to seek healing or demonstrate devotion. Perhaps, some scholars suggest, the dancing plague was a kind of twisted mirror of these religious practices, a manifestation of extreme religious distress in a time when the certainties of faith were being questioned and challenged. The dancers might have been unconsciously seeking divine intervention, acting out a desperate plea for help from powers beyond the human. The plague ended as mysteriously as it began. In early September, the city authorities reversed their earlier decision. They banned all public dancing and all public music. They arranged for the afflicted to be taken to a shrine of St. Vitus in the nearby Vosges Mountains, where prayers were said for their recovery. Whether it was the change in policy, the pilgrimage, the cooling weather, or simply the natural end of the outbreak, the dancing gradually ceased. Frau Trophia, the woman who began it all, disappears from the historical record. We do not know if she survived, if she recovered, if she ever understood what had happened to her. She becomes a symbol, a name attached to a mystery, a woman who stepped into a street on a summer day and found herself unable to stop dancing. The dancing plague of Strasbourg reminds us that the human body and mind are capable of things we do not fully understand, that suffering can manifest in ways that seem bizarre or inexplicable. It reminds us too that we are social creatures deeply influenced by those around us, capable of catching not just diseases but behaviors, emotions, beliefs. As you drift towards sleep, let go of any compulsions of your own, any patterns that drive you without your full consent. Let your body rest, still and peaceful. There is no need to move, no need to respond to any demand except the gentle call of sleep. The dancers of Strasbourg have been still for nearly 500 years now. Their suffering is long over, and you too can be still, can be at peace, can simply let yourself rest. In a villa outside Rome in the year 1912, a book dealer named Wilfrid Voynich is examining a collection of old manuscripts that a Jesuit college is selling to raise funds. Among the dusty volumes, he finds something that makes him catch his breath. It is a book unlike anything he has ever seen. A manuscript written in a script that resembles no known language, filled with illustrations of plants that do not exist and diagrams that make no sense. Voynich, an experienced dealer in rare books, knows immediately that he has found something extraordinary. But he cannot know that he has found what will become one of the great unsolved mysteries of the modern world, a puzzle that will frustrate cryptographers, linguists, and scholars for over a century. Let us drift back further to the creation of this manuscript, sometime in the early 1400s. We do not know who wrote it or where, though the vellum pages have been carbon dated to between 1404 and 1438. Someone, somewhere in Europe, sat down with pen and ink and began to write in a language that perhaps only they understood. The manuscript is not large, roughly 240 pages, though it may once have been longer. Some pages are clearly missing. It is divided into sections, each with its own character. The first section is botanical, page after page of plant illustrations. But these are plants that no botanist has ever identified. They have roots and leaves and flowers, but the combinations are wrong, impossible. Some have been compared to real plants, cacti or sunflowers or herbs, but the resemblances are always imperfect. The second section appears to be astronomical or astrological. There are circular diagrams with stars and symbols, charts that might represent the movements of celestial bodies or might represent something else entirely. Some pages show what look like zodiac symbols, but again, nothing quite matches the standard medieval representations. Then comes a section that is perhaps the strangest of all. Page after page shows small naked women, drawn in a simple, almost crude style, bathing in pools or tubes of green or blue liquid. The pools are connected by pipes and channels in elaborate systems that seem to have no purpose. Some scholars have suggested this section deals with biology or medicine, perhaps representing bodily fluids or systems. Others think it might be alchemical, the pools representing stages of transformation. No one knows for certain. Throughout all of this runs the text, written in a flowing script that looks almost familiar, almost readable, but ultimately remains impenetrable. The alphabet contains about 25 distinct characters, some resembling Latin letters, others unique. The words, if they are words, follow patterns. Some appear frequently, others are rare. There are structures that resemble grammar, patterns that suggest syntax. Statistical analysis shows that the text has properties similar to natural languages. It is not random gibberish, but what language is it? Attempts to decode the manuscript have occupied some of the best minds in cryptography. During World War II, American codebreakers worked on it in their spare time, hoping to apply the techniques they were using against enemy codes. They failed. Modern computers have been turned to the task, programs designed to recognize patterns and break ciphers. They too have failed. Some scholars believe the manuscript is written in a constructed language, an artificial tongue created by its author for privacy or philosophical reasons. Others think it might be an elaborate cipher, a method of encoding Latin or some other known language. Still others suggest it could be written in a now extinct language, perhaps from a community that left no other written records. Then there are the skeptics who argue that the whole thing is a hoax, an elaborate fake created to fool collectors or perhaps as a kind of Renaissance art project. The problem with this theory is the sheer effort involved. The manuscript contains approximately 35,000 words. Creating that much coherent-looking nonsense, maintaining consistent patterns and structures throughout, would have been a monumental task with no clear payoff. Recent theories have focused on the possibility that the manuscript is a women's health manual, written in a secret code developed by midwives or healers. This would explain the botanical sections, which might represent medicinal plants, and the bathing women, which might illustrate hydrotherapy or birthing practices. It would also explain why the language is unknown, if it was a specialized jargon used by a community of women whose knowledge was passed down orally and rarely committed to writing. Another intriguing theory suggests the manuscript might be the work of someone with a cognitive or neurological condition that affected their language processing. Perhaps someone who could think and reason, but who experienced written language in a fundamentally different way, creating a system that made perfect sense to them but is inaccessible to others. Or perhaps the manuscript is exactly what it appears to be, a book of knowledge in a lost language from a lost community. Medieval Europe was more linguistically diverse than we sometimes realize. Communities could be isolated, developing their own dialects and traditions. If a small group had its own written language and that group disappeared, died out in one of the many plagues or wars that swept through Europe, their language could vanish, leaving only this single artifact. The Voynich manuscript now rests at Yale University's Beinecker Library, where it has been digitized and made available to anyone who wishes to study it. Researchers around the world continue to work on it, applying new techniques, new technologies, new theories. Every few years someone announces they have cracked the code, but so far none of these solutions have withstood scrutiny. And so the manuscript remains what it has been for 600 years, a mystery in book form, a collection of pages that refuse to yield their secrets. There is something almost comforting about this, about the existence of a puzzle that resists all attempts at solution. It reminds us that there are still unknowns in the world, still mysteries that technology and intelligence cannot immediately solve. As you let yourself drift towards sleep, imagine the unknown author of the Voynich manuscript working by candlelight, carefully drawing their impossible plants and carefully inscribing their undecipherable text. They had a purpose, a message they wanted to preserve. Whatever that message was, it has been kept safe in obscurity, protected by the very incomprehensibility that makes it so fascinating. Perhaps some mysteries are meant to remain mysteries, at least for now. Perhaps not every question requires an immediate answer. Let that thought relax you, release you from the need to understand everything, to solve every puzzle. Sleep itself is a mystery, a nightly journey into a state we do not fully comprehend, and that is perfectly all right. The Tower of London looms grey and massive against a grey sky. It is summer in the year 1483, and within the thick stone walls 2 boys are playing. They are princes, sons of a dead king, and they do not yet know that they are prisoners. They do not yet know that they will never leave this place alive. Edward, the older boy, is 12 years old. His brother Richard is 9. Until recently, Edward was briefly King Edward V of England, though he was never crowned. Their father, King Edward IV, died suddenly in April, leaving his 12-year-old son as his heir. But between a boy and his throne stand dangerous men, and the most dangerous of them is the boy's own uncle. Richard, Duke of Gloucester, is the dead king's youngest brother. He is 30 years old, an experienced military commander, respected and feared. When his brother died, he was named Lord Protector, responsible for governing the kingdom until young Edward came of age. It was a position of great power, but it was temporary. In a few years the boy would take control and Richard would return to being merely a duke. But Richard wants more. Perhaps he believes he would be a better king than a child could be. Perhaps he believes the kingdom needs a strong hand, not a boy's uncertain grasp. Perhaps he simply wants power and is willing to do what is necessary to take it. Whatever his motivations, his actions are swift and ruthless. He takes control of young Edward, supposedly for the boy's protection. He arrests the Queen's relatives and supporters, claiming they are plotting against him. He brings Edward to the Tower of London, which is not just a prison but also a royal residence, a place where kings traditionally stay before their coronations. So at first this seems normal, even appropriate. Then Richard brings the younger boy, Richard, to join his brother. The 2 princes are housed in the royal apartments. They are seen playing in the gardens, shooting arrows, enjoying what appears to be a summer holiday. Observers note that they seem cheerful and unworried. They do not understand that the walls around them are not there for their protection, but for their confinement. In June, Richard of Gloucester makes his move. He declares that his brother's marriage to the prince's mother was invalid, that the princes are therefore illegitimate, that they have no right to the throne. It is a transparent legal fiction, but backed by armed men and the support of key nobles, legal fictions can become political reality. On July 6th, Richard has himself crowned King Richard III, and the princes, the sightings become less frequent. At first, they're still seen at the tower windows, still glimpsed in the gardens. But as summer wears on, the sightings stop. By autumn, no one reports seeing them at all. Questions are asked, but carefully, quietly. Richard is king now, and questioning him too directly would be dangerous. The Tudor version of what happened next, the version that comes down to us through writers like Thomas More and through Shakespeare's famous play, is straightforward. Richard, having usurped the throne, needed to ensure the princes could never challenge him. He ordered their murder. 2 men were sent to smother the boys in their beds. The bodies were buried somewhere in the tower. This is the story that has shaped Richard's reputation for 500 years. In this version, he is a monster, a child murderer, a man so consumed by ambition that he killed his own nephews. Shakespeare's hunchbacked villain, declaring that he is determined to prove a villain, has become the defining image. But history is rarely so simple. Richard had enemies who took power after his death, and who had every reason to blacken his reputation. The Tudor dynasty that replaced him needed to justify their own questionable claim to the throne, and what better justification than that they had removed a tyrant and child killer? Some historians have argued that Richard may not have ordered the princes killed. The boys could have died of natural causes. The tower in summer could be unhealthy, and medieval children died of disease with frightening frequency. Or they might have been killed by someone else, perhaps by Henry Tudor's supporters, who would have had their own reasons for wanting the princes dead. In 1674, during renovations at the tower, workers discovered a wooden box buried beneath the staircase. Inside were the skeletons of 2 children. King Charles II, believing these to be the lost princes, had them interred in Westminster Abbey with full royal honours. There they remain to this day. Were they really the princes? An examination of the bones in 1933 suggested they were 2 children, roughly the right ages, and that one had a dental problem consistent with descriptions of young Edward. But the examination was brief and limited. Modern forensic techniques could tell us much more. DNA analysis could potentially confirm whether these are indeed the sons of Edward IV. But here we encounter a strange obstacle. The current royal family has refused submission for such testing. Perhaps they fear the results might be inconclusive, settling nothing while disturbing royal graves. Perhaps there are other reasons, and so the bones rest undisturbed, and the mystery remains. What likely happened to the princes? The truth, as best we can determine it from the fragmentary evidence, is probably sad and simple. 2 boys, pawns in a political game they were too young to understand, were removed from the line of succession and then quietly disposed of. Whether Richard himself gave the order, whether they were killed or allowed to die of neglect or disease, we will probably never know with certainty. They were children caught in circumstances beyond their control. Edward had been king for 78 days, but he was never truly allowed to rule. Richard had been a prince, second in line to a throne he would never reach. They played in the tower gardens in the summer sun, perhaps not fully understanding that the walls around them were closing in. Their story reminds us that power is a dangerous thing, especially for those who have it thrust upon them too young. It reminds us that family bonds can break under the strain of ambition, that uncles can become enemies, that protection can become imprisonment. But let us not end on such a dark note. Instead, let us imagine the princes not as victims, but simply as two boys who, for a brief time, had each other. In those last weeks or months they at least had their brotherhood, their shared games and shared confinement. They were not alone in the tower, and now they are not alone in history. For 500 years people have wondered about them, grieved for them, tried to uncover their fate. They have been remembered where many kings have been forgotten. Two boys who barely touched the throne have touched the imagination of generations. Let their story remind you of what matters. Not power, not ambition, but simpler things. Brotherhood, innocence, the games children play while the adult world makes its terrible decisions around them. Hold these thoughts gently as sleep approaches, and let the princes rest at last, their long vigil of waiting finally over. High on a cliff above the river Seine stands a castle that was meant to be unconquerable. Chateau Gaillard, Richard the Lionheart's masterpiece, built in just 1 year through sheer force of will and unlimited resources. Richard called it his beautiful daughter, his saucy castle, the fortress that would hold Normandy against the French forever. But forever, as it turned out, lasted only 6 years. The castle's story begins with pride and ends with an embarrassment so profound that military historians still wince when they tell it. Let yourself drift back to the year 1196, when Richard, King of England and Duke of Normandy, decided to build the ultimate defensive position. Richard was not just a warrior, but a student of military architecture. He had seen the great castles of the Holy Land during the Crusades, had studied how the Saracens and Crusaders designed their fortifications. He took the best ideas from both traditions and poured them into this single fortress. The location was perfect. A high promontory with sheer cliffs on 3 sides and commanding views of the river valley. The design was revolutionary. Instead of a single curtain wall, Richard built multiple layers of defence, each one higher than the last so that defenders could rain arrows and stones down on anyone who breached the outer walls. The stonework was thick and expertly crafted. The towers were positioned to eliminate blind spots. It should have been impregnable. Richard died in 1199, just 3 years after his castle was completed, killed by an infected crossbow wound at an obscure siege in southern France. His brother John inherited the throne, and with it the escalating conflict with Philip II of France, a patient and methodical king who wanted Normandy for his own. In 1203, Philip laid siege to Chateau Gaillard. The garrison, under the command of Roger de Lacy, prepared for a long defence. They had supplies, strong walls, and the confidence that came from holding what was supposed to be the strongest castle in Europe. The siege dragged on through the winter. Philip tried assault after assault, and each one was thrown back. The outer defences fell, but the inner castle held. Months passed. The defenders began to run short of food, but they held on, expecting relief that never came. King John, back in England, did nothing to save them. Then, in February of 1204, Philip's army discovered something the architects had not fully considered. The castle had a chapel that projected out from the main wall, and beneath the chapel was a latrine chute. It was a small opening, barely large enough for a man to squeeze through, and it dropped down into the castle's waste disposal system. A French soldier, whose name has not been preserved by history, volunteered to climb up this latrine shaft. One can only imagine the courage, or perhaps desperation, required for such a task. He climbed up through the filth and darkness and emerged inside the chapel. He let down ropes, and other soldiers followed him. The French were now inside one section of the castle, but they were not yet victorious. The defenders fell back to inner walls, preparing for another siege within the siege. But the French soldiers in the chapel set fire to it, and in the smoke and confusion they managed to open a gate. More French troops poured in. The castle that was supposed to hold forever fell because someone climbed through a toilet. It is one of history's great tactical humiliations, a reminder that the most elaborate defences can be undone by the most inglorious means. The fall of Château Gaillard effectively ended English control of Normandy. The Angevin Empire, that vast collection of territories held by English kings on both sides of the Channel, began to crumble. But the castle story does not end with this military embarrassment. It continues a century later with a different kind of scandal, one involving the highest levels of French nobility and accusations of adultery and murder. In 1314, the castle served as a prison for two French princesses, Margaret and Blanche, daughters-in-law of King Philip IV. They were accused of adultery with two knights in what became known as the Tour de Nesle affair, named after a tower in Paris where the alleged trysts supposedly took place. The evidence was questionable, the confessions obtained under torture, but the political motivations were clear. The king wanted his son's marriages annulled. The two knights were executed with horrific brutality. Margaret was imprisoned at Château Gaillard, where she either died or was murdered a year later. Blanche was also imprisoned there and survived 8 years before being released to a convent. So the castle that Richard built as a symbol of military might become a prison for inconvenient women, a place where political problems could be locked away and forgotten. The beautiful daughter had become a tomb. Today, Château Gaillard stands in ruins, open to the sky, its walls crumbling slowly back into the cliff. Tourists walk through the chambers where defenders once stood, where French soldiers emerged from a latrine shaft, where a princess died alone. The river Seine still flows below, indifferent and eternal. The castle's story is a meditation on the limits of human planning. Richard built it to last forever, poured his genius and his treasury into making it perfect. But he could not account for everything. He could not imagine someone desperate or brave enough to climb through sewage. He could not foresee how the castle he built for military glory would become a symbol of shame and suffering. As you let this story settle in your mind, feel yourself relaxing, letting go of the need to control every outcome, to plan for every possibility. Even the greatest military mind of the 12th century could not foresee everything. We can only do our best and then accept that events will unfold as they will. The stones of Château Gaillard have stood for over 800 years, have seen triumph and humiliation, siege and scandal. They have outlasted all the ambitious plans, all the grand strategies. They simply endure, patient and silent as the seasons turn and the river flows. Let yourself be like those stones, solid and enduring, no longer striving but simply being. Sleep is waiting, gentle and inevitable. The year is 1070, and in the fenlands of eastern England a man is preparing for war. His name is Hereward, and he is about to become the last flicker of Anglo-Saxon resistance against Norman rule. But before we meet him in the marshes, let us understand what has been lost. 4 years earlier, Duke William of Normandy crossed the English Channel with an invasion force. At Hastings, he defeated King Harold Godwinson and seized the English throne. But that victory, decisive as it was, did not immediately conquer the entire kingdom. England was too large, too diverse, too stubbornly independent to fall all at once. What followed was a systematic and brutal campaign to crush all resistance. When the North rebelled, William responded with such savagery that the campaign became known as the Harrying of the North. His soldiers burned villages, slaughtered livestock, destroyed food stores. The goal was not just military victory, but the complete breaking of the people's will. Chroniclers later estimated that over 100,000 people died in the famine that followed. By 1070, most of England had been beaten into submission. The Anglo-Saxon nobility had been dispossessed, their lands given to Norman lords. The language of power was French. The old order was dying. But in the fenlands, in that strange watery wilderness of eastern England, something still stirred. The fens were a world unto themselves, a vast expanse of marshes and reed beds and hidden waterways. To outsiders they were impassable, treacherous, a maze where solid ground could give way to sucking mud without warning. But to those who knew them, the fens were a fortress, a place where local knowledge mattered more than military might. Hereward knew the fens. He had been born on their edge, in the lands around Bourne in Lincolnshire. The historical record tells us almost nothing certain about his early life. Later legends would fill in the gaps, creating a romantic hero, but the truth is simpler and perhaps more interesting. He was a thegn, a landowner of some status but not of the highest rank. When the Normans came, they took his lands and gave them to one of William's followers. According to one account, they killed his brother and left the severed head displayed as a warning. Whether this particular detail is true or not, it represents the reality of the conquest, the casual brutality that destroyed thousands of Anglo-Saxon families. Hereward gathered followers, men like himself who had lost everything and had nothing left to lose. They established a base on the Isle of Ely, a raised area of solid ground surrounded by the impassable fens. It was a natural fortress, accessible only to those who knew the secret path through the marsh. In 1070, a Danish fleet arrived off the English coast. The Danish king, Svein Estrithson, still harboured ambitions of reclaiming the throne his predecessor Canute the Great had once held. His fleet represented a potential game-changer, a real military force that could challenge Norman rule. Hereward made contact with the Danes and forged an alliance. Together they launched a raid on Peterborough Abbey, one of the wealthiest monasteries in England. The raid was justified, somewhat unconvincingly, as an attempt to rescue the abbey's treasures from its newly appointed Norman abbot. The raid succeeded. The abbey was stripped of its gold and silver, its reliquaries and chalices, its accumulated wealth of centuries. But then the Danes did what Vikings had been doing for generations. King William sent them a massive bribe, and they took their share of the loot and sailed away, leaving Hereward and his English allies to face the Normans alone. Despite this betrayal, more rebels flocked to Ely. Among them was Morcar, the former Earl of Northumbria, one of the highest-ranking Anglo-Saxon nobles still at large. His arrival transformed the rebellion from a local uprising into something more significant, the last organised resistance of the old English aristocracy. William could not ignore this challenge. In 1071, he personally led an army to the edge of the fens and laid siege to Ely. What followed was a clash between two completely different types of warfare. William had the finest heavy cavalry in Europe, knights in armour on powerful war horses. But horses cannot charge through marshes, and armour becomes a death sentence when the ground gives way beneath you. The Normans tried to build a causeway, a solid path across the marshes to Ely. Contemporary accounts describe it as nearly 2 miles long, a massive engineering project. But the defenders set fire to the reeds around it, and the causeway became a death trap. Flames and smoke and men in armour drowning in the mud. Still, William had one weapon that the defenders could not match: money and the corruption it could buy. He made contact with the monks of Ely Abbey, whose island home had become a battlefield. The monks, perhaps fearing the destruction of their monastery, perhaps simply bribed, agreed to show the Normans a secret safe path through the marshes. It was this betrayal that ended the rebellion. The Norman army appeared where it should have been impossible for them to go. The fortress of reeds and water was breached. Morcar was captured and spent the rest of his life in a Norman prison. Many of the rebels were killed or executed, but Hereward escaped. All the earliest sources agree on this. He slipped away through the marshes with a small band of loyal followers, and then he vanishes from the historical record as completely as if the fens had swallowed him. Later writers, eager for a proper ending to the story, invented several. Some said he eventually made peace with William and lived out his days quietly. Others said he was hunted down and killed. But the truth is we do not know. Hereward disappears into the mists of the fenland, becoming a legend, a symbol, the last free man of Anglo-Saxon England. His rebellion failed. It was always going to fail. One man, however skilled, however brave, however intimately familiar with the landscape, could not hold back the tide of history. The Norman conquest was too organised, too well funded, too ruthless to be defeated by a guerrilla force in the marshes. But sometimes the importance of a story is not in its success but in its existence. Hereward fought when the fight seemed hopeless. He refused to submit when submission would have been easier and safer. He held out long enough to prove that the spirit of resistance had not been entirely crushed. In the centuries that followed, his story grew and changed, became part of the foundation of English identity. He became a precursor to Robin Hood and other outlaw heroes, the man who fought injustice from the greenwood, or in his case, the marshland. The historical Hereward, the real man, became less important than the idea of Hereward, the symbol of stubborn, hopeless, necessary resistance. Let his story carry you towards sleep with this thought. Sometimes we fight not because we believe we can win, but because some fights are worth having even in defeat. And sometimes the greatest victory is simply refusing to surrender, holding on to dignity and identity when everything else has been taken away. Sleep now, peaceful and undefeated in your own quiet way. Sleep comes slowly tonight, so let us journey to the edge of the North Sea, to the year 1362, to a January night when the ocean rose up and swallowed whole cities. This is not a legend or a myth. This truly happened. The Great Drowning, the Grote Mandrenke as it was known, was one of the worst natural disasters of the medieval period, and yet it is largely forgotten today. Picture the landscape before the flood. The coastline of the North Sea in the 14th century was very different from what it is now. Where today there is open water, there were once fertile islands and prosperous towns. The largest of these was Strand, an island that supported dozens of settlements and thousands of people. The town of Rungholt on Strand was particularly prosperous. It was a trading port connected to the Hanseatic League network that dominated commerce in northern Europe. Ships came and went carrying wool and grain and salt. The town had churches, warehouses, a network of canals for drainage and transportation. Archaeological evidence suggests it might have had 2,000 or more inhabitants, a significant population for a medieval town. The people of Rungholt lived with water all around them. They built dikes to hold back the sea, channels to drain their fields. They were not naive about the danger. They knew the ocean was powerful and unpredictable, but they also believed their dikes were strong enough, their drainage systems sophisticated enough. They had lived with the sea for generations. They thought they understood it. On the night of January 15th, 1362, a storm began to build over the North Sea. Storms were common in winter, but this one was different. The wind came from the northwest, driving water toward the coast with immense force, and the timing was catastrophic. The storm coincided with a spring tide, when the gravitational pull of the moon and sun combined to create the highest tides of the year. The water rose higher than anyone had ever seen it. It smashed against the dikes, finding every weakness, every point where the earthworks were not quite solid enough. And then the dikes began to fail. Once a dike breaks, the destruction spreads rapidly. Water pours through the gap, eroding it wider, and the pressure on neighbouring sections increases until they too collapse. One breach becomes many. What begins as a leak becomes a flood, becomes a catastrophe. The chroniclers who recorded the disaster wrote in language that suggests genuine trauma. They described water rising so fast that people had no chance to flee. They described entire villages disappearing in minutes. They described the morning after, when survivors ventured out to find that the landscape had been completely transformed. Rungholt was gone. Where a town had stood, there was now only grey water littered with debris. Bodies floated in the waves. Animals drowned in the fields. They could not escape. The physical infrastructure of centuries, the dikes and canals and roads, had been obliterated. The death toll was staggering. Contemporary sources suggest that as many as 25,000 people died in a single night, though this number may be exaggerated. Even if the true figure was half that, it would still be one of the deadliest natural disasters of the medieval period. The island of Strand itself was torn apart. The flood broke it into smaller pieces, creating the islands that exist today. The coastline was redrawn. Bays appeared where there had been land. Channels opened where there had been fields. The map of northern Europe was literally rewritten in a single night. In the centuries that followed, Rungholt became a legend. People spoke of it as the Atlantis of the North, a rich city that had been destroyed for its sins. Stories claimed the citizens as arrogant and impious, that they had mocked a priest or desecrated a holy object, that God had sent the flood as punishment. These moralizing tales probably tell us more about later attitudes than about the real Rungholt. Medieval people often interpreted disasters as divine punishment, as a way of making sense of events that seemed senseless. If the flood was God's judgment, then it had meaning, however terrible. If it was simply a confluence of meteorological and tidal conditions, then it was random, and randomness was perhaps more frightening than divine anger. For hundreds of years, Rungholt existed only in legends and in the memories passed down through coastal communities. Then in the 1920s, something extraordinary happened. An unusually low tide exposed mudflats that were normally underwater, and embedded in the mud were stones, bricks, fragments of pottery. Archaeologists began to investigate and realized they had found Rungholt. Since then, careful excavation and survey work has revealed the outlines of the lost town. Streets have been mapped, building foundations identified. The remains of churches and houses lie, preserved in the mud, a snapshot of medieval urban life frozen at the moment of destruction. The artifacts recovered from the site are heartbreaking in their ordinariness. Cooking pots, broken crockery, children's toys. These are the remnants of normal lives interrupted, of people who had no idea that the night of January 15th would be their last night on Earth. The Grote Mandrenke reminds us that for all our cleverness, for all our engineering and planning, we are still vulnerable to forces beyond our control. The people of Rungholt were not foolish. They built good dikes using the best technology available to them, but sometimes the best is not enough. It also reminds us that landscapes we think of as permanent are actually fluid and changeable. Coastlines shift. Islands appear and disappear. What is land today might be sea tomorrow. The earth is constantly remaking itself, usually slowly, but sometimes, as on that January night in 1362, with terrifying speed. Aster, you drift towards sleep. Let the story of Rungholt remind you of impermanence, not in a frightening way, but in a liberating one. Nothing lasts forever, not cities, not empires, not our own troubles and worries. All things pass, washed away by time as surely as Rungholt was washed away by the sea. The mud that covers Rungholt now is quiet and still. The storms have long since passed. The panic and the terror have faded into history. What remains is peaceful, a town sleeping under the sea, waiting patiently for the tides to reveal it again. Let yourself sink into that same peaceful stillness. Let the waters of sleep rise gently around you. There is nothing to fear, nothing to resist. Simply let go and drift, safe and calm, into the quiet depths of rest. We have travelled together through 9 centuries tonight, from the green children emerging from the earth in the 12th century to the flood that reshaped the North Sea in the 14th. We have met people who faced mysteries they could not solve, disasters they could not prevent, circumstances they could not control. The woman who could not stop dancing, the princes who could not escape their tower, the defender who could not hold his island against betrayal, the town that could not survive the rising water. All of them, in their different ways, remind us of the limits of human power and the persistence of mystery. But there is comfort in these stories if we listen for it. Comfort in knowing that people have always faced uncertainty, have always lived with questions they could not answer. The medieval world was full of things its inhabitants did not understand. Strange children, undecipherable books, wild men from the sea. And yet they went on. They recorded what they saw even when they could not explain it. They tried to make sense of their world even when that world refused to make sense. We are not so different. We too live with mysteries. We too face circumstances beyond our control, and we too are doing the best we can, trying to understand, trying to persevere. The people in these stories are long gone now. The green children and the wild man, the dancers of Strasbourg and the citizens of Rungholt, the princes in their tower and the rebels in the fens. Their struggles are over. Their questions, answered or not, no longer trouble them. They have found the peace that comes with time, with distance, with the simple fact of endings. And you too can find that peace tonight. Whatever mysteries or worries you carry, whatever circumstances you cannot control, you can set them down for these hours of sleep. They will still be there in the morning if you need them, but for now you can rest. Feel yourself sinking deeper into comfort, deeper into relaxation. Your breathing is slow and even. Your body is heavy and still. The stories we have cared tonight are like a river carrying you gently downstream, away from the shore of waking, out into the deeper currents of sleep. There is no need to stay alert now, no need to analyze or remember. The stories have done their work. They have filled the time, occupied the busy mind, given it something to rest upon instead of churning through worries. Now even the stories can fade, can become soft and indistinct, can blend into the gentle static of approaching sleep. Medieval mysteries, unsolved and unsolvable, can wait until another time. The questions can remain questions, the unknowns can stay unknown. What matters now is only this: breath in, breath out, the gentle rhythm of a body at rest, the softness of your pillow, the weight of your blanket, the quiet darkness of your room, these simple, present things. Let the medieval world recede into the past where it belongs. Let the people in our stories rest in their long sleep, and join them in that rest, not forever, but for these necessary hours. Sleep is waiting, patient and kind. The mysteries can wait too. Everything can wait. Simply let go now and sleep.